Okay, everybody. I think we make a start. Right, this is finally the last session. We always know, usually by now, and this is true, most people have actually gone home and left the festival. This is a kind of extra to the festival. And we usually invite people to come and have a drink with the team of organisers who are all, as we speak, unpacking the festival downstairs. And indeed, we're all going to go and have a drink in the Royal College of Art Student Union after this. But it just always feels a little bit brutal to say to those of you who've got the stamina to stay drinking with us, just kind of see you in the bar. So we wanted to kind of just have a bit of a get-together before we did that. And that's why we're doing this question time, what next? I wanted to just stress, those of you who don't know, I'm Claire Fox, I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas, that the Battle of Ideas is more than a talking shop, it is more than a festival. And I wrote in the blurb for this session that it was a declaration that ideas matters and it's time to get serious. And that if we really want to shape the future through debate, which is the tagline for the festival, we have to think about the challenges beyond the festival weekend itself. And the aim of the festival is to understand the world with a view to changing it for the better. So I had the idea that I'd ask 5 of our speakers to do something absolutely impossible, which is I'd just give them a few minutes, literally just a few minutes, no big profound speeches, to tell us name either their 1 or 2 biggest challenges they think face us over the year. The Battle of Ideas is an ongoing project, and we'll be organising, as the Institute of Ideas, a whole range of debates throughout the year. The actual Battle of Ideas itself is not over, in as much as the Battle Satellite programme continues indeed this week, with a debate in Oxford on Wednesday, a debate at the Sheffield Documentary Festival on Friday, and then with satellites in Frankfurt and New York the following week. So there's still Battle of Ideas events going on, but we also want to think about the ideas that we can come back to during the course of the year and then come back to at the festival. Over the course of today, there's been about 800-900 people here. Yesterday, there was well over 1,000 people at the festival. So I commend you for being the hardcore. You are the ideas vanguard, in my opinion, so well done. Let me introduce my panel very quickly. They've all spoken before, but you won't have all heard them. In the order they're speaking, we have James Boyle there at the end, who's the chair of the British Council Scotland, former controller of BBC Radio 4, and founder of Edinburgh UNESCO City of Literature, which we actually debated last year, as it happens, and Glasgow UNESCO City of Music. Next up, we're going to have Anthony Horowitz, the journalist, critic and novelist, the author and creator of Alex Rider and Power of Fire novels, and the creator and screenwriter of Midsummer Murders and Foyle's War. My mother is particularly excited that I have any knowledge of you whatsoever, which is not to suggest that I don't watch both as well, but we're delighted that Anthony's here. We have Professor Susan Nyman, director of the Einstein Forum in Berlin, the author of a fantastic book, Moral Clarity, A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists, and also Evil in Modern Thought. We then have Dr. Catherine Rake, the CEO of the Family and Parenting Institute. She just started at that. The Family Parenting Institute have been one of the supporters of one of the parenting debates here today. Before that, Catherine was director of the Fawcett Society, and in 2008 was given an OBE for services to equal opportunities. Before that, she was a lecturer in social policy at the LSE. And then finally, James Panton, who's a lecturer in politics at St John's College, University, Oxford. In fact, they're hosting the debate, the Battle Satellite debate we've got in Oxford on Wednesday. And he's also the press and campaigns coordinator of the Manifesto Club. So take up your challenge. Can I invite James to kick us off, please?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a thrill. I'm going to speak about the economy in an accent absolutely identical to Fred Goodwin's. So, bad start. The most chilling thing I heard this year was on television in the US, where I heard an American economist turn to a British interviewer and say, yeah, okay, your financial sector's down. Now what are you going to sell? Well, like everyone else, I've been caught up for years in the euphoria, the personal euphoria of rising house prices. That's about the limit of my knowledge in the economy. Rising house prices, this is brilliant. Sorry. Yeah. Rising house prices, this is brilliant, I thought. And I did have personal qualms about it and all the rest of it. And then the bubble burst and I heard this man say, "What are you going to sell now?" And I think now in my despondency, I think that actually there's something good in the middle of this. And it is that we can use this opportunity, but we really have to rethink not just what we've been doing and what we've been selling and what we might sell, but rethink the way we live, to look at problems in society which have previously been bypassed by the surge of the kind of foam of the economy in the last 10, 12, 15 years. And I think it goes like this. I think there are problems now which we can have the political momentum to look at because we can give them an economic patina and an economic excuse to do them. The most disgraceful problem in Britain, social problem, is that we are increasing the number of people who can't read and write every year. It's an absolutely outrageous thing. When I started my career in the BBC, I worked in a project which was called the Literacy Project. The Russell Report and the Alexander Report both looked at it and discovered numbers of illiterate people in Britain which were atrocious. We've bypassed that long ago. In Scotland, where I come from, the government will admit that 20% of the population has serious problems with functional literacy and illiteracy. Let me stop on that bit, but say, here's an opportunity now to put a different top on that. It's not something that's going to hold back the bankers or the hedge fund managers. It's a terrible drag in the economy, even if you don't want to see it as personal disasters for the 1 million people in Scotland whom that applies, or the 5 million in England and Wales. It's a drag in the economy. Second thing, at the other end, we've been promised universal service commitment by the DCMS to roll out, and the Prime Minister's behind it, to roll out broadband connection for everyone. And I think, somewhere in the middle of the question, what are you going to sell now, is always going to be people. It's going to be the brilliance of our fellow citizens. Let's roll out that broadband connection. Let's get ourselves universally connected up. But for goodness sake, let's look at it in the context of the whole thing, including illiteracy. If we're rolling out connections, let's look at what we might save by connecting up some communities, not just with the end of the wire, but with the resources to go with it. There isn't anything more wasteful than uneducated people. And believe me, there is nothing that costs the National Health Service more, schooling more, or anything you can name than people who disastrously for themselves can't read or write. So I'm looking for two things: an attack on illiteracy, and secondly, a complete social think about the rollout of broadband.
Thank you very much, James. They're two very big problems and challenges. Anthony, your thoughts?
I always have to be very careful before I go on any panel, because I have to remind myself at the end of the day I am only a children's author. And therefore I tend to concern myself mainly and exclusively really with children's issues or issues relating to young people. And therefore it's hardly surprising that for me the next major challenge, and the one that exercises my mind most of the time, is to do with the Independent Safeguarding Authority and the laws which have come out of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act of November 2006. These laws, which are beginning to strike home now, are effectively summed up by vetting, the fact that authors have to be vetted now before they go into schools, and that all parents and all adults have to be vetted before they can have any involvement with children, and related laws around that. And I brought with me, and I'm very happy today to have met Jenny Bristow, who I believe is somewhere in this audience, who wrote this absolutely extraordinary and informative pamphlet about this very subject, which tells us that apart from other things, up until last year, £500 million have been spent on this. There are 4,000 civil servants at work every day, issuing 300,000 permissions a month for you to deal with children in any form, or for me to go into a school. I was at Downing Street a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to say to Gordon Brown, when did you have your CRB check? There were a lot of children in the audience, and I have to say, of the two of us, he looked much more suspicious than me. But this story has actually broken out now because it's become sort of tabloid fodder, and every single day we read a new story. For example, in today's Sunday Times, some of you may have noticed a really extraordinary story about a little girl who was made to walk home 1.5 hours in the dark because the teacher who was on hand to pick her up hadn't been CRB checked, and therefore the point was that it was safer for her to walk home in the dark and the wet and perhaps be picked up by God knows whom than taken home by a teacher. More recently than that, we had the Watford playground where parents weren't allowed to go in and play with their children. And the other story, which made me quite sad, was the two policewomen who had a deal with each other that one would look after the other's children while they were at work, and they were told they couldn't do this. And the trouble is that these tabloid stories, although they are sort of the things that get your indignation going, tend to trivialize the whole thing, because I believe that what is happening is that for the first time perhaps in human history, two generations are being completely torn apart from each other, and that children can no longer look at us, and we can no longer at children in the way that we did. And this legislation is actually not just obstructive and silly, and at the end of the day, of course, completely useless. Let's not forget that Ian Huntley, who started this all up, had actually been CRB checked. And also, of course, that recent horrible case of the women who took photographs of children at a primary school, that woman had been CRB checked twice, so it's also useless as well. But the worst of it is that it is pernicious. It is actually destroying the very nature of being human. And one of the things that most worries me is that I think we're all pretty certain that we will have a Conservative government in 6 months' time, but not a single Conservative spokesman has yet stood up and said they will dismantle this horrendous legislation. So I just hope that somebody will provide the pressure that will see that come to pass.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Anthony. Susan.
So I live in a couple of different countries, but none of them is Britain. And what that means is that when I was asked to come up with challenges, I had to think on a universal scale. I do the Enlightenment, and so maybe I'm inclined to do that as well. I could have talked about the economy. I could have talked about the environment. I don't think those two are as much in conflict as was suggested a bit in the last discussion. But I thought, since this is a battle of ideas, it would be interesting to move to the ideal level and to say that what I'm most concerned about in the coming year is working on the split between religious and secular people. Morality is often coupled with religion. Claire was saying that the program she does kind of blurs the distinction between them. In my last book, I tried to take that coupling apart by arguing that religion is not the foundation of morality, and by using biblical stories to show that even if you have a direct line to God, as presumably Abraham did at Sodom and Gomorrah, it doesn't give you moral certainty. I saw an interesting review of my book recently in a Church of England publication, and they blew the title. They called it Moral Certainty, and it's actually called Moral Clarity. I don't believe in moral certainty, but okay. But if I'm opposed to the idea that religion can give directions either to Osama bin Laden or George W. Bush, I'm just as opposed to the scorn heaped by many secular people on religion. Even Richard Dawkins admits that God's non-existence is only very probable. It's not something that we can know one way or the other. Here, I believe that Kant was right, not about everything, but about the idea that whether God exists or not and how the world began is beyond the realm of human knowledge, okay? So that piece of the debate is simply not available to us. The question is, what do we do, all right? Do we acknowledge, and I kind of assume, though I saw a head or two nod, that I'm speaking to an audience that mostly identifies itself as secular. Does it mean that we are able to open ourselves to the critiques coming from fundamentalist religious groups all over the world that there's actually something deeply missing in most of the assumptions of Western consumerist society, and that we need to clean up our own house and look at certain kinds of values that have been falsely seen as being grounded in religion. And I could talk about a whole set of values, but I want to focus on the one that upsets secular people the most, and that's a sense of reverence. I think it's something that we're missing deeply. I think that reverence is not about despising the human or looking at us as blights on the planet, as came up in the last discussion, but acknowledging that whatever it was that created the world, it wasn't me, okay? Now, if it wasn't me, first of all, I have something of a responsibility for giving back something to creation, for the gift of living in it. And that allows me to do several things. One is in quite practical terms. I know in the States that the one basis on which people on the left and people from religious groups have actually been able to organize together productively is on questions of the environment, which I think are absolutely crucial. The clock is ticking. But it also enforces a sense of gratitude that I believe is a moral emotion. Gratitude is something that can counter the kinds of resignation, cynicism, and pessimism that allowed for a string of jokes in our last session that I guess are very funny about the wisdom of Woody Allen saying people are either miserable or wretched. That's, the world gets divided into things like that. I think it's a cool emotion. People aren't embarrassed to talk about it, but I think it's a deeply undermining one. So that's all I'll say for the moment.
Thank you very much, Susan. Catherine, your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much, Claire. Well, our work at the Family and Parenting Institute establishes what modern families look like, what those families' needs, and how we act to meet them. And we are, of course, particularly concerned about how all of this shapes up in a recession. But to answer James's point, we do know one thing that sells in a recession, and that's nostalgia. Make, do, and mend is the motto of the age. Allotments are now the most trendy thing that you can get your hands on. And you can now buy tea towels with the motto, keep calm and carry on, printed on them in 1950s text. Nostalgia sells. But we need to recognise that nostalgia can also be very dangerous. It often misrepresents the past. It can forget what we love about the modern. And for the family and the debate on the modern family, the danger is that nostalgia will make us think that there was once an ideal time for family life without trouble or strife. And it can make us think that we need to recreate that ideal, turn back the clock. This will be the big debate at the next election. And of course, we do have to come to it with a grain of truth, remembering the truth of 1950s life. Of course, family life has always been more complex than that. And the 1950s nuclear family came with all sorts of other consequences. It's in living memory that single mothers were allowed to stay with their children up to the age of 2, but were separated from them thereafter. And there are women alive now in their 60s and 70s for whom that has cast a very, very long shadow. So let's meet this debate about family life with healthy respect for the past, but also a healthy respect for the diversity of family life. Yes, buy the tea towels. Yes, do a bit of gardening. Yes, make, do and mend. But try to recreate 1950s family life that never was? No, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. James Panton.
So I had my two related themes, but when Claire called and asked me if I'd step in on this panel, she might have said a few minutes. I thought she said 22 minutes. So I might just get through one of my themes. But both of my issues, I think, are expressions of a very powerful cultural dynamic at the moment, which is about how we view ourselves, how we view other people, and perhaps broadly how we view individual action and collective social engagement. And we are encouraged, I think, on a number of levels to view these things as problematic, fraught with danger, most likely destructive to each other and indeed to the world around us. And I'm delighted that Anthony brings up the ISA theme, the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act, which the Manifesto Club, my organisation, has campaigned against since 2006. And that's part of my first example, what I would call the hyper-regulation of everyday life. The tendency to encourage us and indeed to force us to live our lives through license. So the idea that all of you in this room, until you have undergone a CRB check, are a potential child abuser until, as Anthony points out, a rather useless piece of paper, a rather useless vetting procedure demonstrates that you're not. Then you have a license to relate to children. And indeed you have a license, in the case of the Watford Playground, to relate not just to your own children, but to other people's children. That's an example of living our lives through license. But I think it's also broader than that. It's part of a broader dynamic in which we view other people's actions as potentially dangerous to us. You look at over the last few years, a number of bits of legislation, the introduction of bans on smoking in public places, an ever greater number of public spaces which now become no alcohol zones, codes of conduct attempting to regulate formally and semi-formally the kinds of ways in which we react, interact and relate to one another, the kinds of words that we use in relation to one another, the banning of photography, or at least the delegitimization of the idea that you might think it perfectly normal and straightforward to be taking pictures in public places, a whole arena of different pieces of legislation and regulation through which the different kinds of informal, semi-formal and once quite private and spontaneous areas of human life are being regulated. The premise, I think, behind this increasing hyper-regulation of public, of everyday life is the idea that left to our own devices, we will cause each other harm. My cigarette smoke will harm your health, it may do, it will offend your nose. The difficulty is not that those things may not be true, I think they're quite likely true, but the difficulty is the idea that we couldn't possibly negotiate those kinds of informal relationships for ourselves, rather than having a piece of legislation blanketly laying things down. Your drinking in public space intimidates me, endangers me, threatens me, it leads to social breakdown, it promises a constant danger of abusiveness and violence. But there's no possibility that in our communities we could actually look at how people behave in our public spaces. On the contrary, we regulate and ban drinking in public spaces. And of course your desire to... Am I at 23 minutes already?
Yeah,
and of course, your desire and interest in my children is something which is profoundly unhealthy unless you can prove that in fact you're a decent person and you have a license to have an interest in children, that you're an okay person to be left with my children, even including on a phone-in show that I was on the other day, an ice cream man who told the audience of the 5 Live discussion programme how appalled he was that ice cream men don't need to be vetted, and yet they obviously have access to children, you know, to wield their kind of ice cream and confectionery to unsuspecting vulnerable children in the community. But obviously there was a panic in the room as we suddenly discovered that the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act didn't go far enough. But then he said, I have voluntarily undergone a CRB check, and I display my certificate on my ice cream van in order that parents know that their children are safe with me. This living of life through license, I think, not only incapacitates us in the idea that we can actually take a bit more charge of our lives, a bit more charge of our individual and collective lives, and take control of our lives. The biggest problem is that we don't only accept this hyper-regulation, we often call on it. We often assume that other adults are a potential threat to our children. We often assume that I can't negotiate with you about where we smoke or where we don't smoke, or where we drink or where we don't drink, or how we behave in public spaces. So a profoundly antisocial character of that hyper-regulation. And that, I think, if we've got any interest in taking more charge of our lives, is something that we need to really politicise, draw the dots between those different kinds of examples and really challenge and say, actually, we can take charge of our lives. We'll organise these things for ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Right, straight over to you. This is the way it works. If you want to ask any of the panel a question, just like kind of on question time, I'll get them to answer it. You might want to tell us what you think the challenges are for the future, but don't then pretend I've invited you onto the panel and do a 4.5-minute speech. This is meant to be fast and furious. So quick questions and quick points. And and some people still want to speak. So that gentleman there is the first person I saw. And then I'll work round, yeah? Is it
Hello.
on? Yeah.
It's just a quick comment. I think I have the quote correct, which says that educate a man and you educate an individual, educate a woman and you educate a family. As a person who has a CRB check and doesn't particularly believe in the validity of them, what I would like to say is that this has been the most inspirational thing for me as a teacher. If you inspire teachers, as you have inspired me this weekend, you'll educate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. So please keep going with your work and actually try and target teachers, because they get very tired of all the regulation that is imposed upon them, and they forget the incredible inspiration and chance they have to affect children's lives. So please keep up your work, but focus on teachers as well.
Oh, thank you. That's the sort of what we want is contributions that are nice to this weekend and to ideas. Right, the next person I'm taking is that gentleman there who actually gave me some roses before he spoke. It wasn't bribery, but anyone who wants to give me roses is also good. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Martin, still labouring in a personal capacity. Now, the IOI, I think people would agree, is a great meeting place, but suffers quite a bit from ivory towerism. Certainly didn't apply to the balloon debate, I'll give you that. So my question is, would society be a better place if all the good people here joined the political party that they intend to vote for at the next general election, including you, Claire?
Yes, thank you. I will answer later. Thank you for that important question. And this gentleman here.
I would like to ask Catherine whether she considers divorce and fatherless children to be social goods.
That's it. Right, that gentleman there. I'm doing this quick fire.
Yeah, I just hope that the debate that Adair Turner opened over what is valuable and what is not valuable about what the city does, what is socially useful, what is useful to our economy and to our national life, continues and is not sidelined by whether we should split the banks into retail and investment and so on. It is a central debate, it's a central issue, and I hope it won't get clouded away by politicians in the election campaign.
Okay, thank you. Nice one. Yeah, that gentleman there, and then here.
My question is to James. For my sins, I just spent 4 days with members of the National Literacy Trust. I'm sure they don't speak highly of me either, but National Literacy Trust, and effectively it was their manifesto looks at literacy and functional literacy in a very dumbed-down way, in my understanding. So you're kind of pleading for increased literacy. I understand, and I agree with. The problem is that redefining it as communicating and listening, and therefore saying that because children have low attention spans, they are functionally illiterate, I think is actually demeaning the concept of literacy and reading. Reading is more than, as the National Literacy Trust say, a method of acquiring a skill for a job. Reading is about making the world open to young children and to adults. So I think that, I agree with your pleading for more reading and better literacy, but as long as we stop redefining it, be honest with the statistics that people aren't that illiterate, and actually aspire to a better understanding about what reading is for.
Okay, thank you. And then there,
Yeah, Susan, can you hear me?
Stand up. Anyway.
Okay, Susan's reverence and gratitude. You say you were questioning whether that applies to me, but
I don't
actually,
know you, but
yes. We understand the very old, we understand the very large, we understand the very small, and everything in between. The big new thing that we've got to be in awe of, and we know almost nothing about, is the very complex. And the enormous complexity of everything that's living, and it's especially of human beings and especially of human society, is something that we should be in absolute awe of and admire intensely and celebrate with every second of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I saw a hand right at the back, and I'll come to you. Right at the back, was there a hand? Yes, there you go.
This is the 5th Battle of Ideas, and I've been to each of them. And many varied and important issues have been debated. I just wonder if there are some subliminal orthodoxies that have become embedded in members of the Institute of Ideas debating matters. It's not at all that I don't regard it highly. I've been to every one, and I commend you highly.
I don't know about subliminal orthodoxies. My view is make them as explicit as possible. Anyway, that's the lady with the yellow hat, and then the hand behind. Then I'm going to see whether the panel wants to say something. Then I'll come back for one last bit. Yeah, go on.
Kind of following on from what the gentleman at the front was saying, on a practical level, does everyone on the panel or some of the people on the panel have one thing that I could do if I'm not an important member of a political party, I'm not a lobbyist, I'm not in a think tank, I'm just a PA, what can I do? Is it sign up to my political party? What are your suggestions?
Okay, thank you. And then the one hand behind, then I'm going to come back out, yeah? But let me just get, yes. Yeah.
I think what I'd like to see.
Stand up.
Sorry, what I'd really like to see in the next year is people absolutely forgetting the advice to keep calm and carry on. Get mad, get political, get involved, and change it.
Thank you very much. Okay, right. Anthony, anything you want to respond to quickly from so far? Is there anything you want to say? Has anyone said?
I'm still reeling from the idea of these ice cream men looking at, with their... I wouldn't let my children go anywhere near someone called Mr. Whippy.
Susan, anything?
All of the complex, lovely thought, but I'm not sure that it's a new one. Alexander Pope wrote on Newton's grave, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be always light. I mean, that was about awe before the relationship between complex instances. So I'm all for it. I'd like to know what the orthodoxies are, subliminal or not. But 3, to the woman who asked one thing to do. Again, I truly believe in the slogan, think globally and act locally. So there's a sense in which I'm the wrong person to respond to your question, except insofar as I can tell you that a year ago in my country and internationally, no one really and truly believed the change that could come through the organization of at least 14 million active, ordinary people from all walks of society. And if it could happen there, I'm sure it could happen anywhere.
Okay, thank you very much. James?
3 quick points. One, on the question of illiteracy, which I think is quite important. Illiteracy of a slightly different order, but I teach at Oxford, and I have a great many students who come through the education system at the moment who are intellectually illiterate in terms of the kind of training and the push that they've had to actually develop their understanding. Many of them benefit from the guidance of some very good and inspiring teachers, which links to your point. I think focus on the teachers, but also let's try and build a confidence in an education system where teachers can actually teach and inspire kids without an awful lot of the flattening out of the knowledge content of that education. And what can the lady in the yellow hat do? I would say refuse to have your life organised and regulated from above in the myriad ways that it is being regulated, and therefore take a bit more control of your life and of the lives of people around you. That would be a start. And just a quick comment to Susan, I think, in answer to some of what she said. I don't quite go with Dworkin's kind of scientific empiricism. In my view, not just in my view, I know that God doesn't exist. And I also know that I create the world. And I think that's the basis of my moral perspective. And we need to have a bit more confidence in that capacity that we create the world on a daily basis in what we do, and we can decide how we want to create the world in the future.
Just one word to that. I don't think I think our possibilities are almost unlimited. And, to add to your advice to the woman in the yellow hat, I think the most important thing to remember in life is that much more is possible than we're told all the time. We can do much more with our lives than we're led to expect. But we're not unlimited, and we actually don't create the world. I think there's a big difference between what is and what ought to be, and one is the province of human beings, and the other is the world as it's given to us. So,
thank you very
Is this
much.
the wrong time to?
No, yeah, no, yes, Catherine.
Well, I was asked a quite explicit question about whether I thought divorce and fatherless children were a social good. I think what is a social good is loving families that support their children and their dependents, that give them the financial, economic and social support that they need. Do they come in one form? Of course they do not. They come in all sorts of different forms, and what we've got to do is meet the reality of where families are. Nobody thinks divorce is a social good, and nobody certainly enters a marriage thinking that they want to end up divorced. It's a very sad consequence and a very difficult choice that people make, and it's a choice that people make in full consciousness of their family circumstances and trying their very hardest to do their best. Unhappy marriages are also not a social good, so I think we've got to give people the choice, respect those choices, and make sure those families get the support that they need. That's the social good.
And very quickly to Austin on reading. My talk on reading and its wonders is talk 2. Honestly, on literacy, we have big problems in this country, and not least because no one is bothering about it. They're the people at the bottom. They're not celebrities. Leave them. Let me give you an example of why it matters. Boots at the moment are working on a project to try to help people who can't read and write deal with the very difficult problem of prescribed medicine. Compliance with prescribed medicine is a universal problem. It probably applies to everyone from Anthony to me. The whole business of, do you ever finish the course, do you do what your doctor tells you, and so forth. But there is an absolutely established correlation between recurrent ill health and failure to comply and illiteracy in this country. I've worked in this, and it's a great sadness apart from anything else. Boots are working on it, and I think we might see the beginning of something in there. This is a practical, everyday problem. I give you everything else on reading. Reading is absolutely fabulous. Second thing about orthodoxy, and I can't remember who said it, the business of embedding orthodoxy and the answers. I was in the city where I grew up not long ago, in Glasgow, and I hadn't been in it for a while, and I was looking around and thinking, all of this is familiar to me. Most of the poverty and even the recurrence of TB is recognizable to me from the 50s. And I'll tell you one thing that I think we've got to do. We've got to get away from the straightforward social benefits analysis, and we've got to look at the best ideas that we peddle elsewhere in the world. I would like to see somebody, and I mean this seriously, look at poverty and try to operate it on a development model. Ask Mohammed Yunus, rather than asking some of the folk that have worked on it and failed for 60 years in politics in the west of Scotland.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, last points. Yeah, in the middle there, then over there, yeah.
I just wanted to ask the panel, how do we raise the level of discussion of these challenges out there to the level that is taking place in here? Because it's great, it's very stimulating, but we're a niche. This is a tiny spot in a big world, and unless people out there start talking like this, nothing changes.
Okay, great question. Right, person here, because you've got the mic, and then you, sir. Yeah.
That's a very hard point to follow. Ice cream and vetted, I'm surprised they're still allowed to sell high-fat sugar snacks to children, quite honestly. But I wanted to thank Catherine for pointing out the very obvious but never stated truth, which is that the austerity back to World War II lifestyle, where we all grow our own food and walk the children to school and mend clothes instead of buying them from Primark, is a return to domestic labour. And let's face it, we know who's going to be doing it.
There was a young man called Bright who travelled faster than light. He went out one day in a relative way and came back the previous night. I wondered if we've had this plea for literacy, could we have a plea in Britain before the lights go out at the Battle of Ideas for a bit of numeracy and a bit of science from all the lovely humanities and arts people at the front, whom I much respect. I've forgotten all my physics. But if we don't have some people who can talk science and technology from the arts community who are energized to uphold technological progress, then really we will be debating in the dark for the future. Can you get behind that, please?
Thank you very much. Right, so there, that white shirt there, then you, sir, and then I'll go back to you. I think that might be it. Yeah. Quick.
It's just to the question of what I can do, and I think it is a really pertinent one. And it just seems to me that a lot of people who have other views that often have been hotly contested today, whether it's anti-globalization, people, or the Green movement, they've been very good at a couple of things: blogging and writing and organising meetings and discussions and debates. And the idea that we can make the world that we want to live in starts really with us. That's where the responsibility is. So what can I do? Well, have the debates, have the discussions, encourage people to organise, parents, when they're being told they shouldn't behave in a certain fashion. Blog about it, write about it, and get involved with people like the Institute of Ideas and set some things up yourselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, you, sir, and then you. Yeah.
Well, I was actually just going... Sorry. I was actually just going to ask about the blogosphere specifically, and whether the panel thought that it was at all useful as a method of taking forward ideas. I'm afraid I've spent a little time on it myself this year, and a lot of time working out exactly what to say, and then going back later to see what other people have said, and then wondering whether that was a good use of my time. So what are the panel's views on that point?
Thank you. Where are we? Oh, yes, there you are, sir. Yes. Gentlemen, stand up so they know who you are to give you the mic.
Hi, thanks. This is kind of an answer to the woman with the yellow hat as well. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of pessimism in the world. I think we've heard today there's a lot of people have talked about economic crisis, political crisis, crisis in the media. Yeah, everyone's kind of very sort of negative language. And I actually think we've got to look sort of historically. We've actually got it incredibly good. So I think we should also reflect a little bit and actually, thank God that we're in this situation now, and just smile at each other.
That's the last contribution I'm taking from the floor, because it's then we have to smile at each other, which is a nice one. Right, panel, your final thoughts, and then my final thoughts. Right, James.
Just to come back on one in particular, the Limerick gentleman, I absolutely agree on the nonsense. And one of the mainsprings, one of the wells of that mistake is the annexation of the word creativity by people in the arts. It's absurd and it's graceless to move creativity out of science. It's just crazy, and we shouldn't do it. And we're all perpetuating it.
Catherine.
Well, I wanted to also come back on the lovely Limerick. One of the things that I'm actually a social scientist by training, so I wouldn't claim to be a scientist, but I do understand some numbers. And one of the things that drives me absolutely potty is the fact that people confuse correlation with causation. So just because two things happen at the same time does not mean that one thing has led to the other. And the way that some of the social stats are banded around without a proper understanding of what might lead to other things. So I hate to use this example again, but I'm going to. If you look internationally in terms of this causation at variety in family forms and poor outcomes for children, there's no correlation. Because actually, when you look at some of the Scandinavian countries which have very high rates of lone parenthood, they don't have poor outcomes for their children. The reason is that they don't keep as many people in poverty. The reason that we have such poor outcomes for lone parents in this country is because we immediately plunge them into poverty. So there's an illustration of how we confuse without actually properly understanding, because we can't see whether it's causation or correlation at a national level. We've got to look internationally, and there's some work just about to come out to underline that. That shows you how poor understanding of social science actually can have a huge impact on the moral debate. So that's what I'd say. And the final thought that I had, because I did want to end on an optimistic point and to pick up your point on the blogosphere. I mean, I think, this is just another form of communication, and hopefully it can be a form of communication for social change. And all of us have got the powers to have an effect on this debate. So you're now known as the woman in the yellow hat. I hope you... So I just build on what you say and find the area of activity in which strikes your passion, and do it in whatever way that makes the most immediate change, because we all have that power there.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Jim?
Well, I mean, certainly I support the... Ooh, a bit loud. Certainly I support the call for greater scientific literacy, but also greater belief in science as a means by which we can collectively engage in the world around us. My second point, my 24th minute, was going to be looking at the way in which the current discussion around climate change, whatever's going on scientifically, reduces us as human beings essentially to carbon emitters and nothing else. So I think a belief in greater scientific literacy for kids has got to be a belief in the creative and experimental possibilities that come with our capacity to engage the world, and we can attempt to inspire kids a bit more with that creativity in the world of science rather than morally indoctrinating them, as I think we're doing, and limiting their capacity to actually learn any kind of proper science at school. But I mean, that then leads me to the question about how do we raise the level of discussion out there. Well, I think one thing is that we demand a bit more of ourselves, and we demand a bit more of each other. And we also expect a bit more of other people in terms of their capacity. We expect a bit more of kids in schools in terms of what they can do. I think we might get close towards resolving the problem of illiteracy if we were not only to focus on the problem of illiteracy, although that in itself we can focus on, but actually to expect an awful lot more of the creative capacities of kids to actually engage with education and knowledge, and we're letting them down at that level. But also to expect a bit more of the possibility of people out there being an audience for ideas and a community within which we can share ideas and create ideas and actually start taking a bit more control of the lives that we lead. So I think demand and expect a bit more of each other. So that's my optimistic point of closing.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I agree with both those points, but I want to put them slightly differently. I want to respond to two questions that I have spent quite a lot of time working on. One is how to raise the level of discussion. Yes, there are problems with giant international media conglomerates that have a vested interest in making us stupid and lowering the level of discourse. But I also believe as a moral principle that what you learn in kindergarten, cleaning up your own mess first, before you point the finger at somebody else, is the beginning of moral responsibility. And to that score, then I have to simply say, as an intellectual that's responsible for that side of the public discourse, an awful lot of us can't write. We're really boring. And I do my best to put myself out of that but it's an effort. It's not an effort that's rewarded often by the traditional academic institutions. You can easily get kicked out of them if you write too well or look down on. And if we view that as a real task from our side, that is making ideas as fascinating, interesting, and alive as the latest MTV video, we will have gone a long way. We'll still have to worry about media conglomerates, but that's the work that we have to do. And the second question, what are humanities people going to do about sciences? I got to say, this is really against my general principle, which is not to point the finger at other people before I've cleaned up my own house. I run an institute called the Einstein Forum that, among other things, has the mandate to bring together people from the sciences and the humanities. And I got to say, after nearly 10 years of doing it, I really need to point the finger at some of the scientists. I mean, we make jokes among the staff about, oh God, you remember the Nobel laureate who was just, the worst speaker we ever had. The truth is there's an awful lot of contempt among natural sciences for the humanities. It's at least as serious a problem, I think, as the innumeracy, the lack of knowledge of math and physics of people like me. I mean, mea culpa. I'm more limited than I ought to be. But I do think that there needs to be a kind of push from those of us towards the natural scientists who we tend to be a bit intimidated by. They get the grants, they get the attention, politicians believe that they're the ones who are really going to change the world, and they tend to be rather self-satisfied in what they feel responsible for reading and communicating. We also need to stand up and say, guys, there's actually, the world is going to be decided, I believe, particularly given the resurgence of fundamentalist religion, the world is going to be decided by ideas and not simply by numbers.
Thank you very much. Anthony.
I guess what I've been most struck by today in listening to all these discussions, again goes back to James and the Manifesto Club. We began by talking about how we view ourselves. I think there's a real tension between how we view ourselves and how we behave in life and how we discuss ideas amongst ourselves and how we're meant to do these things and how we're told to do these things. Coming here today on a train, I was standing at the end of the carriage, and I noticed that as I stood there, just at one end of the carriage, there were 17 different signs telling me how to behave at that particular moment in time. The one that most annoyed me was one at the very end of the carriage, which had two little cartoon figures, one of which said, "I'll give up my seat," and the other one was saying, "I'll say thank you," which says not only to adults that you should behave in a certain way, but if you do someone a kindness, you've got to say thank you. Now, this infantilization of adults is, I think, a terrible, terrible way to be going. And just to pursue what James said, you mentioned cigarettes and things like that. The way we are told we cannot smoke anymore and go along with it, it may be a good thing, but nonetheless, some might disagree, the way we can't drink in certain places, then very quickly becomes, you may notice, the way we can't think or say certain things. I was thinking about that other question time a couple of weeks ago in which Nick Griffin was so hopelessly and horribly trashed. Simply, yes, he's repulsive, but because he thinks certain thoughts, I think we have reached a dangerous point in society when such things as Holocaust denial becomes a crime. I think we should allow people to have horrible thoughts and then use forums like this to disagree with them rather than allowing lawmakers to do it for us. So I'm afraid my answer, and goodness knows she must be regretting she wore that yellow hat now, to that lady is, I think we need to relearn the art of tolerance, because tolerance is so much part of what we are. Thank you.
Okay. For what it's worth, a few of my ideas, and particularly in relation to what next, I suppose, which is part of the theme of this. Has the Institute of Ideas, through the battle of ideas, got some subliminal orthodoxies? Yes, but they're not subliminal. We are, as the Institute of Ideas, committed to a range of things. We're a membership organisation. I hope you all join. But we are, to state some of the obvious ones that people are familiar with, we're humanists. We believe in freedom of speech, no ifs, no buts. We believe in freedom. We believe in personal autonomy and not being treating adults like children. We are committed to unlimited growth and economic prosperity, and we are worried about the kind of cautious, limited, risk-averse society that we live in, and that leads us into conflict with certain of the broader orthodoxies of our time, such as environmentalism, a situation where people can quite happily say at this festival, as they did, that there's too many people on the planet, that too many people are the problem. It's becoming increasingly the case that population control is accepted, openly and widely discussed. And I disagree with that, right? Nothing subliminal about it at all. I completely and profoundly disagree with it. But what I think is that you need to have things like the Battle of Ideas, where those disagreements can be had out in public by people like me, loudmouths like me, with other loudmouths with different views. We actively and openly encourage debates around all of these different questions. We don't assume that the audience or the panelists will agree with each other. We don't assume by any stretch of the imagination that everyone's going to agree with the Institute of Ideas or me. That would be very far-fetched. But we do hope that by having the debate out, even our intellectual enemies at the Institute of Ideas will become better intellectually equipped for that argument. What drives us mad in a way, what drives us to organise this festival, is that these arguments are not had out, that actually they're brought in. And I mean, that's one of the things that was so irritating about the whole vetting scheme. I was grateful to the Manifesto Club that they raised drew my attention to it in 2006. And it's taken them a few years of battering away to kind of draw this to public attention. But it was not something that was being discussed. They had to have a campaign to get it discussed in the public sphere. And then actually, at every Battle of Ideas, we have had debates on the overprotection of children. I started off saying that in my opening address. We raised it here, and people said, you cannot not have a debate entitled The Overprotection of Our Children Being Overprotected and have Esther Ranson on a panel. But we did, she was, and at that, the Manifesto Club raised their concerns about vetting. And as it were, a little bit of history was made then, because actually now people are worried about vetting. And that's what politics is all about. It's about having arguments out. What do we stand for, and what should we do? Well, we are idealists. And what I would like to see is idealism becoming fashionable again. You know, when I say I'm an idealist, people sort of say, oh, you know, you should have grown out of that by now, Claire. Or they sort of think, nutty fundamentalist in sight. You know what I mean? This woman, you know, she's got nothing holds her back. You know where the idealists lead us, and death camps spring to mind. And, you know, anyone who's kind of like, you know, is far too audacious to be idealists. We're all meant to be managerialists. We're all meant to be pragmatists. Well, we're not at the Institute of Ideas, and I would like to encourage people to be idealistic, to believe that they have the capacity to change the world and to shape it, and part of that shaping it is to believe that ideas matter. I genuinely think that ideas can change things. Apart from anything else, you know, the battle of ideas has been going for 5 years. It started off as an idea on a scrap of paper. It didn't exist at all. And I remember writing down a proposal that we would have a festival of ideas and we'd try and see if we could get a few hundred people to it, and we'd have all these things. I sort of did all that, and I kind of showed it to a few people, and they sort of said, yeah, no, it'd be good. And then they said, you know, and I said that we could have, and this was the first battle of ideas. I said, at any one time, there'd be 3 debates going on at once. And so we said, that's a bit much. And then when we actually did it, we had 4. And I spent the whole of the kind of 3 months before panicking that, oh, we've got 4 on, who'll go to them, right? And so on, right? And what actually happened was that people said, let's turn this idea into a reality. I know that this is a sort of minor in the course of world history, the Battle of Ideas existence, but nonetheless, this is how it happens. Let's turn that idea into a reality. And people got more and more involved in it, right? And then it became something more significant. Oh, and I've got a note. Right, okay. So if you do not believe that ideas can shape things, then there is absolutely no point in having anything to do with the Institute of Ideas or getting involved in the Battle of Ideas. It is true, right? The clue is in the title, generally speaking. We do happen to think that's true. We happen to think that ideas are man-made, in the broadest possible sense, and that human reason can conquer all. That humanity has the creativity, the ingenuity, and look at what we've got so far. The thousands and thousands of years of our civilization has created the greatest art, the greatest music, some of which we heard last night, has solved huge numbers of social problems, has at least proven that you can eradicate poverty in some places in the world, and there's no reason why we can't do that everywhere. These were ideas that were then implemented and turned into something that had a real impact on the world. We have solved lots of medical problems, and we have created things of great beauty. And we are actually not despicable, a blight on the planet. And there aren't too many of us. There are not enough of us. And what we need to do is go forth and multiply, not literally, go forth and multiply in the sense of going out and looking at each other. That gentleman down there said smile at each other. Well, I'd say smile and then have an argument. I'd say, as Anthony said, if Nick Griffiths walks in the room, what are you frightened of? I mean, he's not a frightening man, right? Have an argument with him. Not because you care about Nick Griffin, but because other people will be listening to that argument. Let's try and win a few arguments. In other words, let's believe in ourselves and each other, and the capacity for us all to be changed and to be change makers. Now, let's go and have a drink.